Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ACE webinar series. My name is Jackie Crockford, and I am here at the American Council on Exercise headquarters in San Diego. Today, we are going to be talking about how we got it all wrong, nutrition recommendations for heart health. And with me today is our presenter here in the studio, Justin Robinson. Hi.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Justin's been with us before a few times on a lot of these nutrition conversations, so it's going to be a great talk today. And before we get started, let's just make sure that everybody is on the same page as far as housekeeping and a few logistics. So if you can, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar dashboard. You should see a hand symbol on the left-hand pane of that dashboard. Go ahead and click the hand symbol, and that'll just let us know that we are coming in loud and clear and that you guys can hear us just fine. So go ahead and click that hand, raise that hand up on your webinar dashboard. Great, thanks guys for clicking in there. Troy, I see you, and Teresa, thanks a lot. Susan, got a lot of hands popping up, so that's great. Also on your GoToWebinar dashboard, there is a questions box. So in that questions box, feel free to type any questions that you have as we go through the presentation today. We will take some time with Justin at the end of the webinar to answer those questions, and potentially even in the middle of the webinar if something comes up that's really relevant that we want to discuss right on topic right there. So feel free to type any questions in that questions box. Also, if you have any difficulties or are experiencing technical difficulties, feel free to use that questions box. I'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation today. So type in anything that you'd like answered right there in your GoToWebinar dashboard. If you would like to earn CECs for today's presentation, you can do so by accessing that on the link provided on the screen. That's acefitness.org/past webinars. And after viewing the presentation and passing the 10-question quiz, you will receive 0.1 CECs within your MyAce account. Again, that's for $19.95. You're listening today for free, so we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us. But if you would like to receive those CECs, you will need to make that purchase using the link provided and pass the accompanying quiz. So let's get right into this. Let me introduce to you our presenter, Justin Robinson. Again, he's joining us here for, I don't know, maybe the fourth or fifth time.
Yeah, something like that.
Good. So he's been with us here a few times. A great resource for us to have here at ACE. He is a blog writer, has done some of our live webinar classes as well, and is a registered dietitian. So we have a lot of wealth of knowledge, Justin, with you. Explain to us a little bit about how you got interested in nutrition, just in general.
Oh, great question. So I was always athletic growing up, and like a lot of other people out there, loved playing sports. Wasn't great at everything I did, but just enjoyed it. I raced motocross for a number of years, and I think that's when I first put two and two together, that what I do during the week, running, eating right, can translate to better endurance on the dirt bike over the weekends. So I was probably about 13 when I first read an article on healthy eating for performance, and for me it started small with cutting out soda or limiting it to one soda per day on my own. And then when I got into high school, I was just very interested in anatomy and physiology, and so putting all those together, the fact that I wasn't going to go to college to play sports and that I loved how the human body works, I decided to enter college as a nutrition major. So I was fortunate enough to know at 18 or so what I wanted to be when I grow up. And I did my dual undergrad in kinesiology and nutrition at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I did my registered dietitian internship at the University of Houston. And then I came to San Diego for grad school in kinesiology at San Diego State. Moved around a couple years, and I've been back in San Diego for a year and a half now. And this is definitely feeling like home. And so, again, happy to be here and happy to share some good knowledge today and get a good discussion going.
Great, thanks. So we are going to be talking about how we got it wrong. It is February, so this month is Heart Health Month, and we've got a few things going on with the American Council on Exercise, so be sure and check out a lot of the information that's out on our website. We've got some blogs around heart health, and that's why we really wanted to go through this webinar and have Justin discuss the information around heart health when it comes to nutrition. So Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you. And remember, guys, if you'd like to ask any questions, please do so on your GoToWebinar dashboard.
Excellent. So just a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today, and I'll tell you a little bit about what this presentation is and what this presentation is not. So we will talk a little bit about food politics, but I think everyone on either side of the spectrum is a little tired of politics in general, so no political rants from me today. I'm going to do my best to provide objective information regarding dietary recommendations and their development. I'm not here to demonize any one entity or any one person. When I talk about what quote-unquote went wrong, I was part of that wrong equation as well. And so I'll discuss some of how my recommendations as a dietitian and health professional have changed even over the last 3 to 4 years. Likewise, I'm not here to demonize any one macronutrient, sugar or fat or any single food group. Most importantly, I'm not here to sell you guys anything except just some knowledge, some thought process. So what I am here to discuss is we'll essentially go through a timeline, as you can see on the screen now. We'll start in the late 70s when we decided that something had to be done about heart disease, how some research studies influenced the first set of dietary guidelines that came out in 1980, how those dietary guidelines have changed over the last 30 years. Depending on how old you are, some of you are definitely recognizing some of those food models. And then we'll discuss what we can do about it as personal trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, group exercise instructors, dietitians, behavior specialists, ACE-certified individuals, what we can do to provide better recommendations to our clientele. So we have a couple of poll questions as we go through this today. So the first poll question, yes, we're there. We have first poll question here. We're loading this on the screen here, but a little pop quiz. So those first 1980 dietary guidelines. Let's go ahead and take a vote here. What do you feel they were based on? All right, we got some good votes coming in.
For those of you that are seeing your screen right now and wondering about the poll question, feel free to just click on the answer that you feel is most appropriate here, and we will be showing you the results of the poll question in just a few moments. All right, very good. I think we're good here. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll. It hasn't changed over the last 15 or 20 seconds. But most of you have what I believe is the correct answer there. 47% of you said that they were based on logic and assumptions. And I think that is the correct argument there. You can definitely make the argument that it was provided on pressure from lobbyists or media influence. There was some research, there was some expert consensus, but not enough expert consensus. And so essentially what was discussed here is Senator McGovern brought together Congress and said, hey, the American public are far, far too unhealthy. For the last, at that time, 75, 80 years, heart disease had been the #1 killer in America. And to this day, it still is. So we had to do something about it. And so when they came together, they did not have a consensus on what the top 5 or 6 heart health recommendations should be. And that they being lobbyists, congressmen, and health experts. There was a lack of agreement. And so a quote here is, "We senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in." So regardless of what came out, you can definitely make the argument that these guidelines may have been premature or based not 100% on solid research. So the first set of dietary guidelines, as I said, came out in 1980, and they were agreed to be published every 5 years or updated every 5 years. And this is a joint work of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. And so here's a model or just picture here of the cover for the very first dietary guidelines, which were in print
because I don't know if the internet was quite there yet. They were not PDFs at that time. So in 1977, they decided to have dietary goals, and the goals became the guidelines. And based on some research that we'll talk about here in a few slides, the recommendations were to increase carbohydrate intake to 55 to 60% of total calories, decrease total fat intake to less than 30% of calories, decrease cholesterol intake, decrease sugar intake, and decrease sodium intake. And so those dietary goals that came out of those McGovern-led meetings essentially became the dietary guidelines. Very, very few changes there. So as we went through the years here, there was very, very few changes from 85 to 90 and so forth. If you're about my age, graduated high school late 90s, you probably remember learning the 4 food groups, or if you're a little bit older than that, as you went through elementary school. And so the models were attached to it. And so the 4 food groups lasted for quite a few years. Pretty much everyone, I'm sure, remembers the food guide pyramid that was first introduced in 1995. And this replaced the 4 food groups. At this time, this is also when we introduced the nutrition facts label. So prior to that, it was completely voluntary for food companies to list ingredients, grams of carbohydrate, protein, fat, calories, sodium, vitamin information. So the nutrition facts label was part of these 1995 dietary guidelines. They also, at this time, included a set of physical activity recommendations. And that message was essentially balance the food you eat with physical activity. And so based on that message and some of the other messages we'll talk about, the message can be, I don't want to say confusing, but it's definitely not a very specific message. So otherwise, from 1980, very few changes, still the emphasis on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate intake diet. Again, with the thought process of that is what was necessary to correct and prevent heart disease. 2010, we switched to a more user-friendly model, replacing the food guide pyramid with the My Plate. And rather than, I skipped over the My Pyramid, which was a pyramid with a bunch of different colors that, even as a health expert, was way, way too confusing. So this type of model, I feel, is better. It's definitely the most user-friendly model that we've had. However, if you've been to their website, it's still a very, very deep and almost too detailed type of website. And there's still some disagreement, in my opinion, on the macronutrient ranges. So, for example, the other day as I was preparing for this, went in, just played around with it on myself, and it came out to 3,000 calories, but my total protein recommendation was 7 ounces for the day. And I know a lot of you are probably shaking your head saying, well, 3,000 calories, you could probably have 7 ounces per meal. So the protein recommendations, dairy recommendations, I know some people are pro-dairy, some people are total anti-dairy. So regardless of whatever this is, throughout the years, there's definitely been some influence from lobbyists. The Dairy Council, as we know, the Sugar Council, as we know, very, very strong lobbyists, and may have had some influence on these dietary guidelines, for better or for worse. So as we look through these last 30 years, 1980, 2010, it's interesting what has changed and what has not changed. Essentially, the dietary recommendations are the same. We still have that message of reduce total fat, reduce saturated fat, reduce sodium, and increase complex carbohydrate intake. The total percentage of fat had dipped a little bit in the 90s and the 2000s because of the stronger messages and more media coverage. But realistically, the total percentage of calories that we consume from fat in 1980 era versus now have not significantly changed. However, if you're looking at those obesity rates, those have very, very significantly changed. They've doubled over a 30-year time span. So this leads us to the conclusion that fat likely does not make us fat. I know I was taught this, and I, as I said, taught this to people that while carbs have 4 grams of 4 calories per gram, protein is the same, fat has 9. Therefore, if you cut fat, you're going to cut calories and lose weight. What we completely ignored with that is the influence, and I won't get into too much detail on this because it's an entirely different webinar in itself, but we neglected to realize the role of hormones and how different types of carbohydrate, different types of fat, fiber, all can influence things like insulin and cortisol, ghrelin, leptin, and that can change, the way I describe it, is your fat switch. So it's not just the total calories, it's not just the total macronutrient composition of calories, but the types of calories that can turn on or turn off that fat storage switch. So for whatever reason, whatever we did, we weren't receiving that message correctly from the USDA, or they were not delivering the correct message, because fat intake did or did not change it throughout the years, but obesity did change. Leisure time activity also changed. What I mean by that is the non-structured type of activity. So for some people, that's their workforce. For other people, it's walking or doing chores around the house. So leisure time activity has decreased. Total calorie intake has increased, and that is probably a contribution to the obesity changes. However, I know there's definitely an influence of the types and quality of calories that have also changed. So what went wrong? I've discussed it a little bit, but why did the public become essentially fatter and sicker with the introduction of guidelines? If we were lower percentages of obesity and overweight in 1980, and then we provided the public with guidelines, and over those 30 years we got fatter and sicker, essentially what did go wrong? What happened? Well, to start with, some of the research that the initial guidelines were based on was not the most solid type of research. So some of you may have heard of Ancel Keys. He was the lead researcher for the 7-country studies. You're probably familiar or have heard of the Framingham Heart Study. And as I mentioned, there was some corporate influence. But essentially with a lot of these studies, the researchers ignored some data. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this figure here on the left, and I apologize for the quality of it, but it is from the 70s. If you look at the one on the left, they said in these 7 countries, there is a very direct linear, or I guess curvilinear relationship here in the percentage of fat intake and coronary heart disease. But what they ignored were essentially 20 or so other countries, or 15 or so other countries, that there were originally 22 countries in the 7-country studies. But the researchers said, well, it doesn't make sense that they can have, some countries can have a very high fat intake but a low coronary heart disease. So we're just not going to include those countries because that doesn't make sense to us. So because it didn't fit their hypothesis, a lot of countries and a lot of data were ignored. Corporate influence, I think it's the sugar industry. It's similar to what happened with the tobacco industry in 70s and 80s, where they, or even before that, where they supported research and they said that, well, anything in moderation is okay. Alcohol, cigarettes, sugar in moderation is okay. And promoting balance with activity. So things that the public just didn't really fully grasp. Also, in terms of research, I think and this is just a good lesson to learn here, the difference between association and causation. I think a lot of the original dietary guidelines were based on association and not a causal relationship. So here's an example, and this is an actual study. I took a screenshot of this. Skipping breakfast tied to heart attack, coronary heart disease, and coronary heart disease risk. So for a consumer who's flipping through online, or maybe this pops up on the evening news, it's very easy for them to look at this and say, wow, if I skip breakfast, I'm going to have a heart attack. I better eat breakfast. And that's not exactly the truth of this. We know that breakfast is important, unless, of course, you're an intermittent faster, but again, different discussion for a different day. But what they looked at in more detail in the study was that people who skipped breakfast were also more likely to be smokers. And we know there is a direct causal relationship between smoking and heart disease. So the fact that skipping breakfast led to high heart disease was an association, not a causation. And so we got that with the cholesterol guidelines as well. That high cholesterol intake was associated with a poor lipid profile, but not a causal relationship. In fact, the brand new dietary guidelines, or 2015, have removed the cholesterol recommendation. So that maximum 300 milligrams of cholesterol is no longer recommended. Because even Ancel Keys himself now has come clean, so to speak, and said that, well, what we did was not correct, and even he recognizes that cholesterol intake has zero influence on blood cholesterol. So it's okay to eat eggs again. Let's see. So how do we improve our heart health? Let's take a moment to talk about what poor heart health entails. So this term atherosclerosis, which is the development of plaque in the arteries. So it's based on an inflammatory response. So you eat bad foods, you eat very high sugary foods or trans fats or processed foods, and this causes an inflammatory response in the arteries. The body reacts to that inflammatory response, and if it reacts to that inflammatory response long enough, and if there's a high level of essentially bad fats flowing through the arteries, it'll start to accumulate plaque. Nitric oxide production, those of you who are into supplements know that nitric oxide is a vasodilator. Our body naturally produces this, especially when we exercise. But with poor heart health, we get a decrease in nitric oxide production. So we have this hardening of the arteries, and we also combine that with the fact that the arteries have a decreased ability to contract and expand. So we can get a thrombosis or a blockage of the arteries there, and that can lead to a number of different health issues. If it's a blockage to the brain, we can have a stroke. If it's a blockage to the heart vessel itself, we can have a heart attack. So for a number of years, our goal of improving heart health was medication, was supplements. We were focusing on the symptoms rather than prevention. So it was that very, very micro level of approach, very quick to prescribe and want to take supplements. We need a little bit more of a macro approach. We need more of a prevention type of approach. Quote here from Dean Ornish, we were focusing on mopping up the water without first shutting off the faucet. So we were not focusing enough on how to make those dietary guidelines usable for people. So we had good intentions saying this is how people need to eat. We were giving them medications, but we were really skipping a step of how to make those dietary guidelines usable. Yeah, I was 10 years in school and internships. I've been in the profession for about 15 years now, and I still don't know what 30% of total calories from fat actually looks like. I don't know what 10% of saturated fat looks like, or 1,500 milligrams of sodium. So how the heck is somebody who's never had a nutrition class supposed to know that? I mentioned inflammation, and we'll open up the next poll here, but we mentioned inflammation, and systemic inflammation is essentially that chronic low-grade inflammation. So which of the following, in your opinion, dietary-wise, leads to the most systemic inflammation, since that is definitely an integral role in the development of heart disease and quite possibly all other chronic disease in the body? All right, we'll give you about another 3 or 4 seconds here. Get those votes in. All right. Well done here. So we're looking at this, and oh, I like this. I like these answers because it's a little bit spread across the board. Oh, there we go. Now you can see them. Thank you. So about 30% of you said high omega-6 to omega-3. A little bit more than that said high saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio. So the most correct answer here is the most pro-inflammatory, I'm sorry, the most anti-inflammatory diet would actually be there, a low 6 to omega-3 ratio. So the highest, or the most pro-inflammatory, would be a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So we'll take a look at that over the next couple slides here, and definitely touch on saturated fat, since a lot of people had something to say about that. So briefly looking through dyslipidemia here, and we use the term dyslipidemia as opposed to hypercholesterolemia because of HDL. So desirable levels for total cholesterol, LDL, and triglycerides should be relatively low. The higher HDL, the high density lipoproteins are, the better. So when we have low or high cholesterol, high LDL, high triglycerides with low HDL, that's all of our increased risk, and that's considered dyslipidemia. So what we do on a regular basis, our relationship of omega-6, omega-3 intake, saturated fat, processed food, sugar, all of that absolutely affects these blood lipid numbers. And when we discuss or take a look at what inflammation is, it's across the board. Inflammation is a very, very broad term. So here are a few examples. Cellulitis of the leg and inflammation of the skin cells. Arthritis in the hands and knuckles. A swollen ankle is an example of inflammation. Inflammatory bowel disease. So you can see the picture there. On the left, nice smooth colon there, very, very smooth, not very red tissue, whereas the other one is very blotchy, very, very swollen, a deeper red. So that would be an inflamed bowel. So all of these are examples of inflammation. When we talk about heart health, we're talking about systemic inflammation as opposed to a very obvious, more exogenous type of example here. So how do we influence that? So omega-6 fats, so these are vegetable oils, fried food, fast food, polyunsaturated fats here. We have an incredibly high intake of these as Americans. The ideal ratio is probably 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 intake, but most Americans are somewhere between 10-to-1 and 20-to-1. So we have a very, very unbalanced intake of omega-6s to omega-3s, and that can lead to that increased systemic inflammation. The reason we have this, or one significant reason, is that we were told to eat fewer saturated fats and eat more polyunsaturated fats. But the recommendations were not very specific as to polyunsaturated omega-6 versus polyunsaturated omega-3s. So omega-3s, these are ones in walnuts, fish, chia seed, flaxseed. Omega-9 fats, or monounsaturated, are in olive oil and avocado. So essentially what we need to do to help correct some of this inflammation, which can lead to heart disease, is eat more of the things on this slide and eat less of the stuff on the previous slide. So it sounds a little bit more simple than it really is. So the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association put together these 7 metrics of cardiovascular health. And this is what they use to assess heart health: smoking, being overweight, physical activity, dietary health pattern, cholesterol, blood pressure, and fasting blood sugar. And essentially how we rate these is from poor, intermediate, or ideal. So each one of these 7 metrics has its own range. Fasting blood sugar, for example, we know that 70 to 100 is for fasting is ideal. 100 to 124 is pre-diabetes, and 125 or greater is considered diabetes. So with each of these, they rate those as poor, intermediate, or ideal. And if you're less than ideal in one or more categories, that increases your risk for heart disease. So our discussion here, how do we stop smoking, lose weight, get active, eat better, control cholesterol, manage blood pressure, and reduce blood sugar. I think it's interesting to note on this, and I was getting this from a podcast that, again, from Dean Ornish, and I'll give you some other recommendations for some things I listened to in part of this research. But we are naturally happy. We are naturally healthy. We're born that way. It's our environment. It's our choices that make us ill. And so it's funny that we spend all this time trying to reverse diabetes or hypertension or heart disease, when if we sort of went back to a more natural state, and I'm not promoting paleo diet for example, but if we go back to our natural states, that's when we're happiest and most healthy. It's choices that we make in our environment that influence our level of poor health or sickness. Next poll question here. So what do you view, this is pure opinion, what do you consider a moderate sugar intake? And the reason I ask this is that the sugar industry, we mentioned some of their influence on research and on guidelines, is they'll say, well, sugar in moderation is okay. You can have things in moderation. So get some good answers through here. You give you about 4 or 5 more seconds.
And just a reminder for those of you that are answering on the questions box, go ahead and answer right on the screen. All you have to do is click that the link right on the screen, the box or the circle that you would like to select. Select that right on your screen, and that answer will go into our poll.
All right, let's take a look at the answers here. So 51% of you, the overwhelming majority here, said 5 to 10% of total calories, or which is roughly 25 to 50 grams of total sugar per day, is moderate. A lot of you said less than 5%, and then we still had about 10% each of 10 to 20% or none of the above. And that's about what I expected, because if we were to ask this to non-health experts, I think we would get pretty vastly different answers here. So my message is this, that I don't like the term moderate, and that when we say, oh, well, things in moderation are okay, well, I won't disagree with that, but what I do disagree with is the fact that everyone agrees on what moderate means. Yeah, not to give too much away here, but the mid-20s version of Justin versus the mid-30s would have a different explanation of what moderate alcohol intake would be, and I'm sure some of you can agree with that, that a college student versus a father of 2 would have a completely different idea or opinion of moderate alcohol intake. So this term moderate is not an appropriate term. We need to be a little bit more specific.
And I'll just add to that, as we're getting a few other comments and questions on the GoToWebinar dashboard. Thank you guys for chiming in here. Justin, your definition, or what people consider their definition of moderate, is part of the question, but also I think we need to understand, and what people are asking about in the questions box, is what is the definition of actual sugar intake?
Right.
Does sugar mean carbohydrates from pasta that we eat, or does sugar mean
added sugars,
that I eat a candy bar? So that's part of the definition, I think, that may be causing some confusion, not just for people in our industry, but in in the general public.
I 100% agree with that, and that's part of the confusion too. Thank you for those of you who chimed in on that. But that's another thing, is we'll say, well, moderate sugar intake, but we don't necessarily differentiate between added sugar and natural sugar. So in my personal opinion, and what I try to tell to my clients, is that yes, natural sugars are okay. So, and we're going to talk about that in the next couple slides here, but yes, eat an apple, but don't drink soda. Essentially what that comes down to. And while we're on this topic, is the most current set of dietary guidelines, came out in 2015, finally have limitations on added sugar. and that is less than 10% of total calories. So right where what most of you agree with, which comes out to, again, that 25 to 50 grams. I think if we base it on a 2,000 calorie diet, it's right around 40 grams of added sugar per day. And actually, let's just go ahead and go to this next slide, because essentially that's what we're discussing here, is some of the differences between those naturally occurring sugars that are potentially healthy for us, or come with fiber, come with other antioxidants that can be a healthy food, versus some of those more processed foods or added sugars that, as we know, can potentially spike blood sugar, over-release insulin, and potentially lead to inflammation and or weight gain. So when we're looking at some of these foods, applesauce, granola, yogurt, vitamin water, dried cranberry, spaghetti sauces, again, I think if we were to ask the general public, are these health foods, at least 50% of them would say, yes, those are healthy foods. And I would say, well, it depends. 50% of the time, these can be healthy foods, but it's very easy to see applesauce with high fructose corn syrup added. Granola, likely the second ingredient is going to be some form of sugar, honey, molasses. When you're looking at yogurts, 12 to 15 grams of sugar are going to be naturally occurring. So if you're given a recommendation for something like yogurt, and on the nutrition facts, if you see 30 to 40 grams of sugar, you're going to know that the majority of that has been added to it to make it sweet, since regular yogurt is very, very tart. Dried cranberry is very tart as well. Will almost always have added sugar. Spaghetti sauce, it's a vegetable, it's a fruit, right? It's I guess tomatoes technically a fruit, but school lunch programs count pizza sauce as a vegetable. So again, that's an entirely different discussion. But there are a lot of hidden added sugars, and I actually, to plug the ACE blog here, wrote about this a month or two ago, so you can check out a little bit more detail on that. But that 40 grams comes out to about 10 teaspoons of added sugar. And so if there are 1 to 3 teaspoons of added sugar in each of these foods, just by eating some applesauce, granola, and yogurt, you can get your total daily amount of added sugar. And that's not including maybe candy bars or the things that we think of as our treats, or that we know have sugar. So hidden sugar is just as dangerous as the blatant added sugar. So putting this all together, what are some practical recommendations? What are things that you can leave this webinar 15 minutes from now, go work with your clients, and provide some suggestions for healthier hearts, for better overall health performance? And I like getting some good questions here, but talk about a study that was from the New York Times, very, very interesting. And they talked about different types of foods. And they interviewed the general public, and they interviewed health experts, and they said, is this food healthy, yes or no? And so what do you feel was the food that had the biggest discrepancy between what the public viewed as healthy and what health experts view as healthy?
And once again, as you guys are clicking in your answers to the poll question, go ahead and use your screen. Just click right on the screen on the open circle, and we'll get your poll answers here in just a few moments. And if you would like to look at the blog that Justin just referenced, that he wrote for American Council on Exercise just last month, that link is provided in your chat box. So that link is there if you'd like to see a little bit more information on that.
But don't get too distracted and end up leaving the webinar. All right, we're going to go ahead and close this, since the answers are about the same now. Thank you for those of you who chimed in and voted for that. Let's share the answers here. And we definitely have a smart audience with us today. You're correct. 50% of you said that granola bars had the largest discrepancy, and that is the correct answer. So we'll take a look at some other foods here. Whole milk came in at 35%, and we'll discuss where that came in. So here are a few of the pictures from this, and we'll get you that link to this article as well. So once again, they polled health experts, they polled the general public, gave them a list of foods. I think it was the title of it is sushi a health food? And I don't care if it's a health food, it's a Justin food for sure, but it was pretty obvious that both health experts and the general public said things like chocolate chip cookies and french fries were not healthy. And they said things like fruits and vegetables, apples and oranges were very healthy. 96% of the general public and 99% of health experts respectively said that apples and oranges were healthy. Granola bars, 71% of the public said they were healthy, but only 28% of health experts said they were healthy. Whole milk was right along right smack dead in the middle. It was about 50-50. Things like quinoa, health experts said were very healthy, whereas the general public, a lot of them had no clue what quinoa was. So there's definitely a discrepancy here. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is that a lot of times as a personal trainer, and I won't get too much into the discussion of scope of practice, but I feel that as a health professional, even if you're not giving very specific dietary recommendations, it is your job to talk about diet. It is your job to talk about mental well-being and sleep and stress. And so if you're saying to your client, well, hey, make sure you get a healthy snack before our workouts, again, something very appropriate for a personal trainer to say, and that client has a granola bar and some yogurt, well, in their mind, they're eating what they truly believe is a healthy food. But we know that a granola bar can be granola or oats, omega-6 fatty fats, and sugar, 4 different types of sugar and preservatives, and the yogurt can have a lot of added sugar. So they may not actually be getting a health food. They may as well have a Snickers bar and a Coke because that's the level of added sugars that they're getting. So if we're going to give appropriate recommendations, we have to know what our clientele believes. We have to know what their thoughts and opinions about health food is and what health foods truly entail. So speaking of health foods, which ones are not? Saturated fat. I think this one definitely has, it's definitely across the board on what people believe with this. And so some of the, I'll highlight some of the research here. So saturated fat can increase total cholesterol, but at the same time, it can also improve HDL, or that good cholesterol. So when we're looking at heart health, that total cholesterol to HDL ratio may actually be improved. So there's really no significant relationship between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. Again, it's more of an association rather than a causation there. And we do know that when we replace saturated fat with carbohydrate, we can get a lower total cholesterol, lower HDL, but we can increase our triglycerides. So triglycerides are one of those heart lipids that are tied into carbohydrate and sugar intake. And so having a high triglyceride level is essentially just as unhealthy as a high LDL or a low HDL. Further, when we replace saturated fats with carbohydrates, there's really no improvement in cardiovascular disease risk. So that's another flaw of the dietary guidelines for 30 years, is that we said stop eating coconut oil and beef and start eating more carbs. But we were starting to eat the wrong types of carbs. We said start eating more polyunsaturated fats, but we consume the wrong types of polyunsaturated fats. If we were to have replaced red meat with fish, with fruits and vegetables and high fiber carbohydrates, we probably would have been a lot healthier. But we ate SnackWell's low-fat snacks. We started using vegetable oils in everything. And we started drinking fruit juices rather than fruit itself. So some of the research here tying up the saturated fat myth, there is a difference in saturated fat between a processed food like a deli meat and a naturally occurring saturated fat like coconut oil or a grass-fed steak. And so, like other foods, a natural form does not negatively affect our health as much as a processed food. So my first recommendation for my clientele, for your clientele, what's the best diet? Well, the best diet is one that includes whole foods, the one that excludes processed food, things that come in packages. Once again, this is the same scale we saw before. We have a really, really high intake of omega-6s and a relatively low intake of omega-3s. So what we need to do is figure out ways where to increase omega-3s, increase omega-9s, or those monounsaturateds, and decrease omega-6s so that we can balance out that scale, correct some of that systemic inflammation, decrease atherosclerosis and plaque formation, and equally maybe prevent things like high blood pressure and diabetes, since those are arguably results of inflammation as well. So studies have shown that replacing bad fats, trans fats, saturated fats with monounsaturated omega-9s does reduce bad cholesterol and improve triglyceride concentrations. So essentially what I say is think about your plate. Fill up your plate with the good stuff so that you push out and have less room for the unhealthy stuff. Limit added sugars. And these are one of the food plate models from teamusa.org, and it is called the athlete's plate. And we were having a friendly discussion when we were going through this that I believe everyone is an athlete, but I know that term athlete scares some of your clientele potentially. Some of the, maybe especially if they're overweight, they don't view themselves as an athlete. But this model, they have three. So their lower calorie one, which is more for weight loss or a low training day, in my opinion, fits what most people need to do. So again, without getting too much in the scope of practice, a good exercise for you and your clientele. Ask them to visualize their plate for an entire day. Ask them to put their breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, all on one huge entire plate. Ask them to visualize what percentage of that plate is fruits, what percentage is vegetables, what percentage is protein, what percentage is grains, starches, and healthy fats. And then show them something like this. And don't necessarily expect them to look like this right away, but say, all right, where are you now? Here's what's ideal, and how can we create small, smart goals? How can we create behaviors that will inch you towards this? How can we change your pie graph to look a little bit more like this? And then a few months from now, how can we change it a little bit more? And then a year from now, is this something that's feasible for you to do on a very regular basis? Can we get you drinking water or coffee or tea that doesn't have a lot of added sugar? Can we get you to use more herbs and spices instead of salt? Can we get you to cook your food in healthy oils and get whole grains in there, get high fiber foods, and have a lot of color with your fruits and vegetables? So those are some of the exercises, some of the thought processes to go through. To summarize here, fat does not make you fat. The fact that we were very, very unhealthy in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and had a high fat intake, it was not the high fat intake itself that caused heart disease. Buyer beware regarding research. Always look to see who's funding that research study. Not that the Dairy Council can't fund a great article on calcium or a great study on calcium, but keep just, again, buyer beware. Just kind of, sleep with one eye open when you're looking through some of that research. Find ways to make relative changes. Again, in my opinion, 30% total fat, less than 10% of total fat from saturated fat, those are not practical ways to make relevant changes. Figure out what your client is doing, see if they can do one swap, inch them towards what an ideal diet should look like, one that has real food, one that does not include a lot of added sugars, which are going to be listed on the new food labels coming out in 2018. My 3 keys to heart health, as I said a little bit already: eat real food, laugh and sweat every day. And if you can do those 2 things together with a fun workout, even better. But our sleep, our behavior changes, our stress absolutely influence heart health just as much as diet and exercise. And then equally important as the others, work with a health team. We can't do it on our own. There's only so much information we can pack into our brains, and only so much olive branches we can extend to our clients without being part of a team. So a quick, some considerations there is assess your client, see where they are, educate, implement, and then monitor. And I think that monitoring is where we sometimes fall off, is we do a really good job up front, but we don't continue to monitor and reassess, re-educate, and re-implement programming, nutritional programming, exercise programming. A couple links here, and we'll make sure to get these links out to you. There's my ACE blogs. NPR TED Radio Hour has a couple great podcasts to listen to or videos to watch on that. And then if you want those Team USA athlete food plate models, there's the link as well. All the references that I've used today, and that essentially wraps this up. We're leaving, I think we're on pretty good time. We'll leave some time for questions. I know Jackie needs to go through a little bit more housekeeping first.
Hi guys, thanks so much for hanging in there with us. This is a great bit of information. I'm having a coughing fit on this side, so thank you for hanging in there. Just a few reminders about how to connect with us, and then we'll take a few questions with Justin. I know you guys are typing in a lot of questions on your GoToWebinar dashboard, so thanks very much. We will be continuing the conversation with Justin on our Facebook page. So I have included a link on the chat box. Feel free to go to that link, and if we don't quite get to your question today with Justin, that will be open and available for us to continue the conversation with him. And feel free to type your question in there, and that link again is provided on your chat box. So a lot of different ways to connect with ACE via our Facebook page, of course, our LinkedIn account, YouTube, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter as well. So don't forget to connect with us. So again, like I said, Justin, a lot of questions coming in, and I think one of the great ones that kind of will kick us off here will be to just discuss a little bit about the recommendations. You know, the new recommendations came out in 2015, as we mentioned. So how do we kind of explain those as fitness professionals? How do we explain those new recommendations to our clients and kind of help them buy into that and
Sure.
like, trusting what those recommendations are?
Great question, and that word trust is an important aspect of that, because how do we trust something that has, I don't want to say it's failed, but how do we trust something that hasn't worked over 30 years? And the 2015 guidelines don't differ very much from the 2010. As I said, with the exception of total cholesterol and added sugar. So those would be the two differences. I think you have to figure out what makes sense to your client and what's going to translate to your client. Again, and I think I've already said this 2 or 3 times, but I don't think just spouting the dietary guidelines and saying less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium or this many grams of fat, that doesn't translate well, because what does that actually mean? So I think using the food plate model, whether it's the one from the USDA or whether it is the athlete's plate model, getting something very visual like that. I mean, maybe creating your own, creating that plate and doing something along the lines of having them do a dietary record, and then finding pictures of those foods, or having them snap pictures of their food and text that to you, and then showing them what that ideal plate looks like, and then coming up with strategies and behavior changes together to where you can get them towards that. The new dietary guidelines also promote the Mediterranean diet a little bit more, which I like. So whether it's the Mediterranean diet or the food plate model, just finding something that's going to be relevant to your client is what comes down first. And I realize that's not a very specific answer, but that's the best answer I can give, since everyone is different and everyone responds differently to various approaches.
Right. Okay, great. So, kind of just keeping in mind who you're talking to, what type of client you have is really important there. A couple other questions coming in, and Justin, I'm just going to ask you to go back a couple of slides to your references.
Yes.
A couple people asking about those reference slides Let's go back one more.
The resources.
So yeah, so we have some resources, and we'll look at the references in just a second again. Just to let you guys know, there will be a PDF available after the course, so that will be available to you if you would like to view these resources, or you can jot them down right now. So these are a few of the resources that Justin mentioned throughout the presentation. And then we'll go to the references, and those references, again, some of the research articles that we talked about and that Justin referenced, and some of the graphs that were provided are from these references here. So a lot of great information. If you had any specific questions about those, please type them into your GoToWebinar dashboard. And then once again, you will have access to the PDF. If you would like to purchase the course, you'll have access to those within the course in your MyAce account. So a few other people are typing in, a few other questions are coming in around coconut oil.
Yep.
So coconut's been kind of one of the trendier
Absolutely.
Foods and oils and fats. So talk to us a little bit about coconuts, the type of fat that it actually is, and where does that fit in with a healthy diet?
Good question, and I know I'm glad you asked that, because I kind of skipped through it just because we had a lot of information today. So coconut is entirely a saturated type of fat, and I know some of you out there are like, well, it's an MCT fat, a medium chain triglyceride, meaning that the body processes the fat a little bit more slowly, which has been potentially beneficial for extended exercise, endurance exercise, or just more energy throughout the day. Coconut oil definitely has the influence of potentially raising total cholesterol, but as I said, raising the good cholesterol as well. So it may actually overall favorably impact lipid profile by improving the total cholesterol to HDL ratio, which you get just from dividing those two. In terms of the practical side of it, I think if you are replacing unhealthy oils for coconut oil, that's a great step. It's great for cooking. It has very, very high smoke point, meaning that you can use it to fry, whereas olive oil has a very low smoke point, so olive oil is not good for pan frying or high heat cooking because it can actually break down and turn into trans fats, whereas olive oil was probably the best oil for things like dressings or finishing your food. So my favorite oils for cooking would be coconut. I also like walnut, avocado, red palm oil, and grass-fed butter, because those are all very high heat. Where we can get into trouble with coconut oil is by supplementing with it. So if you're still doing your normal diet and then you tack on a bunch of coconut oil and MCT oil, you can just get too many calories, and that's not going to improve heart health. That's not going to lead to weight loss. But if you're pushing out maybe some saturated, some trans, some omega-6s for coconut oil, then you can potentially improve that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and improve heart health. So displacement is the key there.
Okay, great. So different oils are positive. Having a variety of different things in your diet obviously is a good idea, but just checking to make sure that those oils maybe are better for cooking versus, like you said, the dressings for olive oils and things like that. So along the lines of scope of practice, because this has come up now within our questions on the GoToWebinar dashboard, when we are speaking to our clients, if we are a certified personal trainer, if we are a certified group fitness instructor, if we are a certified health coach or certified medical exercise specialist, all with ACE or any other entities that do fitness certifications, it is within our scope of practice to talk about healthy guidelines.
Yes.
As far as nutrition goes, but making specific recommendations to clients that maybe have things like diabetes,
right,
or other health issues like that would be outside of our scope of practice.
Correct. So where we draw the line, and again, thank you for this question, where we draw the line is what we call medical nutrition therapy, MNT, and that is providing specific recommendations to treat or reverse or cure disease, conditions, disorders. So there is I'd say we draw the line there, but there's a little gray area. If you're working with a client who has diabetes and you say you should eat healthy food, that's that's not wrong. But if you give them a diet plan that says, here, this is a diet plan that will help you control your blood sugar and treat your diabetes, that is outside of the scope of practice of anyone who's not an MD or a registered dietitian. So creating a diet plan to treat disease is definitely where you draw the line. But like I said, on the other side of the spectrum, if you're a personal trainer and you never discuss nutrition with your client, I feel you're not fully doing your job. So semantics have a lot to do with it, and that's why I was saying, give guidelines, suggestions, ask them questions about their diet, and those are definitely well within your scope and very appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Great, and I think asking questions is a good point too, because sometimes it's just about awareness of,
definitely.
Oh, I didn't even think that I had to think about my diet.
Right.
So that's a great first step when working with our clients, just asking them questions about what they eat to help them be thinking about it. Great. So we do still have a lot of questions coming in, but it is the top of the hour, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Justin, for your time.
Awesome. Very happy to be here.
So again, we will be continuing the conversation with Justin on our Facebook page, and that link is provided within your chat box. So if we didn't quite get to your question today, feel free to jump over to that link and type your question into that Facebook chat, and Justin will be answering those questions over the next couple of days. Otherwise, if you would like to receive CECs for this course, again, you are listening today for free. We thank you for taking the time out with us. If you would like to receive CECs, please use the link that is provided on the screen, which is acefitness.org/past webinars. And you will need to purchase the course. A recorded version of this webinar will go into your MyAce account along with the PDF of the references and resources and a quiz. After you pass that quiz, you will be awarded your 0.1 CECs within your MyAce account. So again, thanks, Justin, for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Awesome. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.